The wind had a cruel voice that morning, dragging dust through the empty streets of Dry Fork like it meant to scrape the town off the earth entirely. A few townsfolk stood huddled outside the general store, coats clutched shut, eyes narrowed toward the alley between the saloon and the livery. That was where the stranger had fallen. She was curled like a dying animal, skin stretched tight over her bones, clothes more patchwork than garment. Her face was shadowed beneath tangled hair, and her bare feet were purple with cold. The sheriff gave her one glance from the porch of his office and spat into the dust. "Ain't our problem," he muttered, turning back inside. No one moved to argue. An hour passed before Elijah Booker rode into town on his creaking wagon, hauling sacks of grain, and a fresh-made saddle he'd spent the week stitching by lanternlight. He always came on Tuesdays, spoke no more than was needed, and left before the sun reached the spire of the chapel. Folks didn't know much about him, just that he lived alone out past the buttes with an old warhorse, and a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw like a broken road. He tied his horse, and was lifting the grain when he noticed her. She stirred as the wagon's wheel creaked beside her ear. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Her hand reached out weakly, not for help, but an apology, like she knew she didn't belong. Elijah didn't speak. He set the sack down, knelt beside her, and without ceremony, lifted her into his arms. "You taking her somewhere?" the storekeeper asked as Elijah walked by. "She'll die here," he said simply. "That may be," the man said, squinting. "But if she's trouble—" "She's not," Elijah answered, and he didn't look back. At the edge of town sat Doc Merriweather's place, a leaning house patched with tin and smoke-black shingles. The doc was halfway through his morning pipe when Elijah knocked. "Got another stray," he grunted. "She's starving. Fever, maybe worse." The doc stepped aside, pointed to the cot by the stove. "I'll need coin, you know that." Elijah handed over a silver dollar, and then another. When the woman finally woke, it was dark. She tried to sit, failed, and looked around with wild eyes until the doctor spoke calmly from his rocker. "You're safe. That man brought you in." She turned her head. Elijah stood in the shadows, arms crossed. "Why?" she asked hoarsely. He shrugged. Didn't see anyone else doing it. For 3 days, she drifted in and out of fever dreams. She muttered names, screamed once in her sleep, and at one point began cursing someone called Reuben, her voice full of grief and hatred. Elijah never asked about any of it. On the 4th day, she was strong enough to sit up. "I can go now," she said. "I won't be anyone's burden." "I'm not asking you to be," Elijah replied. "I got a ranch. Could use another hand." She stared at him like he'd offered her a throne. "You trust me just like that?" "No," he said, "but I figure trust's earned 2 ways." And that was how Josephine came to ride out to the Booker place, her thin hands gripping the saddle horn of Elijah's second horse. The ranch was small, framed by rust-colored cliffs and thorn brush, with a creek that whispered more than it ran. There was a barn, a sagging porch, and a field of sun-bleached corn that refused to grow higher than a child's knee. It wasn't much, but she took to it like it was Eden. She cooked. She mended. She fixed the fences when the wind tore them loose. She fed the old horse, Thorn, who took to her with the gentleness of a creature long tired of war. She never asked questions and never answered any either. At night, she stared into the fire with eyes that carried too many stories. The townfolk noticed. They saw her riding into Dry Fork beside Elijah once a week. They saw her hands wrapped in cloth from working rope and tack, and they whispered, "She sleeps in his house." "Where's his name now, too?" "They ain't married, far as I heard." Someone checked the town ledger at the post office and confirmed it, Josephine Booker. When asked, Elijah simply nodded. She needed a name. Figured mine would do. The laughter came quickly, sharp and mean. "Well, guess we know what she gave him in return." Josephine heard it all. She never flinched. But that night, she sat on the porch alone, staring at the stars. Elijah joined her, carrying 2 tin cups. "They talk because they don't know what else to do," he said, handing her one. She took it, but didn't drink. "I used to be someone else," she whispered. "I figured. I ran, she said. But it followed. Elijah didn't ask what it was. He just nodded, as though he'd heard the same confession from his own mouth years before. Time passed. One evening, while digging behind the barn for a new fence post, Josephine unearthed something hard. She brushed away dirt until a glint of iron showed, an old revolver wrapped in oilcloth. She didn't call for Elijah. She cleaned it alone, hands steady, breath tight. Then she tucked it under the porch. That night, he found her staring into the fire again, her face unreadable. "You planning to use it?" he asked. "If I have to." He didn't argue. He didn't take it from her either. Spring was slow to arrive. The land stayed brittle, and the sky forgetful of rain. But the rhythm of life at the Booker Ranch settled into something that resembled peace. Still, Josephine kept the revolver close. She didn't know why, but something inside her whispered it wouldn't be peace for long. The outlaws came down from the north, like wolves tasting blood on the wind. They rode hard and dirty, 8 of them in all, led by a man with hair the color of rusted iron and eyes that saw too much. Reuben Knox. Folks in 3 counties still spoke his name like it belonged in a nightmare. He'd been run out of Wyoming after stringing up a judge's son, and rumor said he'd carved his name into a preacher's back before torching the church. Now he wanted quiet, far from telegraphs and bounty sheets. Dry Fork was perfect. He rode in just before dusk, boots caked with road dust, coat stiff from blood and weather. The sheriff stepped off his porch with a hand near his belt, but one look at the man behind Reuben turned his jaw to ash. He tipped his hat and stepped aside. "You boys just passing through." Reuben smiled like a man who knew he owned the air. Something like that. By sundown, they'd taken over the saloon. 2 girls were dragged upstairs. One man was thrown through a window for not laughing fast enough, and the bartender was cleaning blood off the piano keys. Reuben watched it all from the corner, sipping rye, his boots on the table, eyes roaming the town like he was counting every door and every soul behind it. He was looking for something, or someone. The next morning, Josephine rode into town alone. Elijah was nursing a busted axle on the wagon and had sent her for salt and flour. She noticed the quiet first, how folks didn't meet her eyes, how even the horses in the hitch line seemed tense. Her boots hit the ground just as one of Reuben's men stepped out from the barber shop, chewing matchstick wood and eyeing her like a man picking over market goods. "Well now," he said, "ain't you a slice of luck?" She said nothing, brushing past him, but his hand shot out and caught her wrist. "I asked you something, darling." Josephine turned slowly, eyes calm. "No, you didn't." That made the others laugh. For more of Reuben's gang ambled across the street, curiosity turning to hunger as they looked her over. She stood still, her breath slow, one hand brushing the hem of her coat where the grip of the revolver slept against her hip. From across the way, Reuben stepped out of the saloon. He saw her, and his grin died. For a moment, no one moved. Reuben looked like he'd seen a ghost carved out of thunder. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "Joe." The name hit the street like a dropped gun. The gang turned toward him, puzzled. Josephine's face gave away nothing. "You know her?" one asked. Reuben walked closer, boots crunching gravel. "She's the reason we spent 2 winters sleeping in caves, while the Pinkertons hunted us like dogs. She ran out on us in Colorado. Took the maps. Took the coin." "She's the one?" the matchstick chewer asked. Reuben nodded, voice a growl. "She was my wife." Gasps carried through the storefronts like sparks in dry grass. "I'm not yours anymore," Josephine said, steady. "That don't change what you owe." She stared at him. "You came to Dry Fork just to settle a grudge." "No," he said. "I came to burn the world down. You just happened to be the spark I missed." She didn't wait for him to draw. Her hand moved faster than anyone expected, and the revolver barked once, splitting the silence. The bullet missed Reuben's cheek by inches and struck the post beside his head. People screamed. Doors slammed. One of the gang reached for his gun, and then Elijah's voice rang out from the edge of town. "Try it, and I drop every one of you." He sat on the wagon bench, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed cold and clear on the outlaws. His presence was like a ghost stepping out of a tale no one wanted to believe. Thorn, the old horse, stood still as stone beneath him. "Who the hell is this?" one outlaw hissed. "Name's Booker," Elijah said. "She wears my name. That makes her mine to defend." Reuben laughed bitterly. "What is she to you? A chore? A pity case. She's the woman who fixed my fence, fed my horse, saved my life last winter when the fever near killed me. That's enough." The two sides stood frozen in that stretch of dirt street, like gunpowder waiting for a match. Then Reuben raised his hand. "Not today," he muttered. "But we ain't done." The gang followed him back into the saloon. Josephine stood still for a long time, her hand trembling slightly now that it was over. Elijah dismounted and walked to her side. "You all right?" "No," she said, "but I'll be ready next time." He nodded. "I'll make sure of it." She looked at him, eyes glassy with 1,000 memories. "He won't stop, Elijah. He never stops." "Neither do I," he said quietly. They rode home together under a sky stretched thin with clouds, and behind them, the town of Dry Fork held its breath. Something had shifted. The townsfolk had seen it. The woman they'd scorned had pulled a gun on a killer and didn't flinch. And the man they'd mocked as simple had stood with a rifle like he was born to war. But war was coming, and Dry Fork wasn't ready. The next morning, fog hung low over the hills, curling through the scrubland like breath from the earth itself. Elijah stood on the edge of his porch, one hand resting on the rail, eyes scanning the slope that led down into town. The silence was thick, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses in on the chest, waiting for something to break. Josephine emerged from the barn, sleeves rolled to her elbows, shotgun over her shoulder. She wasn't limping anymore. That was something. Her coat hung open, revealing the worn pistol holstered at her side. She looked at Elijah like she had something to say, but it took her a long time to speak. "We can't just wait for them." Elijah nodded. "Didn't figure we would." They stood together for a moment, the prairie wind tugging at the corners of their clothes. Thorn neighed softly from the corral. "They're planning to take the bank," Josephine said finally. "Reuben's got his men watching the road, scaring off the marshal. I heard one of the girls say they're hitting it before Friday. Means we got 2 days." Elijah rubbed his jaw. "We're outgunned, outnumbered. Half the town won't lift a hand." Josephine looked toward the horizon. They might, if someone gave them a reason. They both knew the truth. Dry Fork was tired, beaten before the first bullet. The sheriff wouldn't help. He'd already moved his wife and boy to a cousin's farm, a half-day ride east. Most men in town had families, debts, or simply didn't believe in heroes anymore. But heroes didn't matter. Not now. They needed grit. They needed a plan. That night, Elijah knocked on the back door of the church. The parson let him in, startled, but not surprised. Word of Reuben's gang had reached every pew. "Don't preach, just listen," Elijah said. "We've got one shot. I need help." He laid it out, quiet, careful, step by step. The parson's hand shook when he agreed, but he agreed. By morning, 5 more folks had joined. The blacksmith, gruff and silent, offered iron stakes and chains. Miss Hattie from the boarding house brought a tin of gunpowder she kept under her bed since her husband died in a mining collapse. Even the stable boy, not more than 15, swore he'd run messages and move carts if needed. Josephine moved among them like someone who'd always belonged. She wasn't loud. She wasn't warm. But people listened. She showed the town how to load rifles faster, how to hold breath before firing, how to track boot prints in soft dirt. And she never talked about Reuben. Not once. "We can't take him head on," Elijah said during a dusty noon meeting in the schoolhouse. "But we can split him. Reuben's men don't trust each other much. Noticed it at the saloon. They're always watching their backs." "Divide and pick off?" the blacksmith asked. "Exactly." Josephine leaned over the map of town they'd sketched in charcoal. "They drink heavy after sunset. We start there. Get 3 of them isolated. Make it look like accidents. Spook the rest." "They'll come hunting," the parson warned. "Let 'em," she said. "By then we'll be ready." The next 2 days passed like thunder behind glass. Quiet but full of force. Traps were laid. Alleyways were blocked. Rifles were stashed inside feed bins, behind hymnals, under loose floorboards in the general store. The women passed messages through laundry lines. The children played farther out to keep from drawing attention. And at night, Josephine and Elijah struck. The first man didn't see it coming. He stumbled out of the saloon, blind drunk, laughing to himself, and never saw the tripwire. Broke his neck in the fall. The second found himself locked inside the ice house, door barred, vent stuffed. He froze before morning. The third wandered into the church with blood on his boots and left with a bullet in his leg, hobbling back to camp mumbling about spirits. Reuben wasn't amused. By Thursday morning, he was red-eyed and snarling. 3 men gone. A fourth vanished without a trace. He stomped through the saloon like a cornered bear, pistol drawn, daring anyone to blink wrong. "I want the town quiet," he barked. "No more drunks. No more games. They think they can scare us. We burn it all if we have to." One of his men, lean and nervous, pointed toward the hill. "That old man Booker. He's not just a farmer." Reuben growled. "No, he's a liar who's lived too long." But inside, something twisted. He hadn't counted on Elijah. Or Josephine. He hadn't counted on people remembering how to fight. By sundown, Dry Fork was a drum pulled tight. Every window shuttered. Every horse stabled. Every face tense. Josephine stood in the bell tower of the church with a spyglass, watching Reuben's men patrol, with twitching hands and tired eyes. Below, Elijah loaded shells with the parson, speaking in quiet tones. "You think they'll really come tomorrow?" the parson asked. "They'll come before the bank opens," Elijah said. "They'll want it fast and loud." "And we meet him loud?" Elijah shook his head. "We meet him smart." Outside, the wind shifted, and with it came the scent of something distant and dangerous. Josephine lowered the spyglass. "They're moving." Elijah stood. "Then so are we." Dawn broke with a rust-colored sky, casting a fierce glow over Dry Fork. The wind rolled in low and mean, pulling dust into the alleys and whispering between the shutters like it knew what was coming. Chickens stayed quiet. Dogs didn't bark. The town was still, too still. Elijah Booker stood in the middle of Main Street with his coat buttoned tight and his hat brim low. Beside him, the blacksmith held a hammer in one hand and a sawed-off tucked under his belt. Josephine moved like smoke along the rooftops, rifle in her arms, braid tied back with leather. She'd been up since before the sun, checking traps, loading the last shells, murmuring to Thorne like he was part of the plan. The church bell struck once. A single hollow clang. Then they came. Reuben's gang rolled into town with thunder under their hooves. 6 riders wide, faces half covered with dust rags, pistols swinging from their hips. Reuben rode at the center, black coat whipping behind him, jaw clenched so tight it could have cracked stone. "You've got one chance," he bellowed, voice cracking across the air. "Hand over the bank keys and any man who laid a hand on my boys, or we burn this pit of dirt to the ground." No one answered. Elijah didn't flinch. He just stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like a man about to deliver a sermon or a reckoning. Reuben squinted, surprised to see the old man, standing in the open. "You," he spat. "You think you're the law now." "I'm not the law," Elijah said, "but I reckon I'm enough." Reuben laughed, loud and bitter. "You're a fool." Then came the shot. It cracked from the roof of the mercantile, clean, perfect. One of Reuben's men dropped from his saddle, a red bloom spreading over his chest before he even hit the dirt. Josephine didn't wait. She was already reloading. The gang roared forward like wolves, guns drawn, hooves kicking up dust. Elijah dove behind a water trough as lead tore into the hitching post beside him. The blacksmith fired once, twice, dropping another rider before he was clipped in the shoulder and dragged behind the church steps by the parson. From every corner of town, windows burst open. Shotguns boomed. Traps snapped. A rope hidden across the alley tripped a horse, throwing its rider headfirst into a barrel. The people of Dry Fork didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment. Reuben saw it unraveling. He spun his horse toward the bank, hell-bent on making off with something, anything. But Josephine was waiting. She dropped from the bell tower like a hawk, landing hard behind the saloon. She ran barefoot through the dust, ducked beneath a swinging sign, and intercepted him just as he reached the steps of the bank. He turned and fired. The shot grazed her ribs. She didn't stop. She slammed into him, tackling him off his horse. They rolled across the porch, fists flying, dirt in their teeth. Reuben was strong, but Josephine fought like someone with nothing to lose. She caught him across the jaw with the butt of her rifle and pressed the barrel to his throat. "You remember me now," she hissed. His eyes widened. For a second he saw her. Not the girl from a year ago, not the starving woman in the snow, but the one who'd survived, sharpened by hunger and silence. "You," he muttered. "That's right." She didn't pull the trigger. She let him stand, gun still drawn, but her voice steady. "Run," she said. "Run like the coward you are." But Reuben wasn't the running kind. He lunged. The second shot came from behind. Elijah's bullet hit him square in the spine. Reuben collapsed with a grunt, blood pooling in the dirt. It was over. Smoke drifted up from the street. A few horses limped off. 2 of the gang surrendered, dropping their weapons with trembling hands. The rest were dead or gone. Townsfolk emerged slowly, stunned, blinking like they'd woken from a long fever. The parson rang the bell once more, this time, not for warning, but for peace. Josephine stood in the middle of it all, dirt-streaked and bleeding, looking like a ghost pulled back into flesh. Elijah walked up beside her, touching her arm. "You all right?" She nodded. "Town owes you," he said. She glanced around at the buildings, the battered faces, the sky just starting to clear. "They don't owe me anything." Elijah smiled faintly. "They'll still talk. Folks always do." And they did. By week's end, stories spread like wildfire. Some said she was an outlaw's widow seeking justice. Others swore she was a bounty hunter in disguise. A few claimed she was a ghost, that she'd vanished after the battle, never seen again. But one thing remained true. A year ago, a man gave his name to a starving woman. No one thought much of it then. They laughed at him for sharing his food, his barn, his coat. But when the storm came, it was that same woman who stood between them and ruin. And every child born after was told the tale. How the town was taken, then reclaimed. How the stranger became their shield. And how the woman no one believed in became the reason they still had a place to call home.